which is Prompt-Based Cognitive Equivalence, Post-Institutional Theory by Frank. A little bit about Frank. He is a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Lethbridge, whose research is at the intersection of information disorder, specifically decolonizing information verification practices in Africa, artificial intelligence, and inclusive technology systems. Over the past year, Frank has delivered presentations in many conferences covering a wide range of topics, including explainable AI systems, prompt engineering, inclusive and decolonial AI design and implementation, AI's role in education, and general utilitarian applications of artificial intelligence. Prior to his doctoral research in Canada, Frank demonstrated his commitment to empowering individuals through technology education and professional development as one of the lead facilitators for the Google Digital Skills for Africa project and a facilitator for McKinsey and Company's Forward program, initiatives which equip thousands of people with essential digital and career skills. Frank is also a steady contributor to All Tech is Human community, which fosters dialogue and innovation to ensure the responsible development of debiased emerging technologies and AI systems. So Frank, the stage is all yours.
Can you hear me very well?
Yeah.
Okay, thank you. So thank you, everyone. It's been a very great conference, and I've learned a lot from virtually every speaker, and happy I've connected with a lot of us. So I'll be speaking very briefly on prompt-based cognitive equivalence theory, toward a post-institutional future of knowledge excellence. And I'll begin from where the literature is currently when it has to do with prompt engineering and what is happening within the field of prompt engineering. So we have a lot of recent studies which have shown that structured prompt training, for example, can significantly enhance students' critical thinking, academic performance, and especially for those who are, within the low resource communities. And so one of the things that virtually every research have actually established when it has to do with the role of prompting in terms of education or AI in education is that it could actually help in developing critical thinking and helping students to become even more creative. However, the theory I'm advancing, which is the prompt-based cognitive equivalent theory, kind of goes beyond just the utilitarian application of AI in education, but actually focusing on making it arguments that through very iterative, dialogical way of prompting, that students and people who are staying or living within the low resource communities or low resource universities could be able to develop the kind of elite, thinking that is very familiar that we're actually seeing, what we've come to call the elite universities or the Ivy League universities. And so, of course, we know what elite thinking is, but just for context purposes, so elite thinking basically has three major things that makes it elitic, right? And the first thing is that if you are thinking elitically, then you understand and navigate power through strategic and systemic reasoning. And then you also use critical reflection and diverse perspective to challenge assumption. Someone who has an elite thinking perspective, questions a lot of things at the same time. And so he doesn't just take information hook, line, and sinker, and also is able to synthesize information at the same time. And the last thing that is very common in elite thinking, which is what you see in many post-secondary institutions, especially those who have very good infrastructure and are not low resource, is that they leverage educational networks to influence decisions and society. And some of these three things are in huge lack in some low resource institutions, particularly in the global south. And so my argument is that prompting could serve as a new academic frontier. And so, like I said, in early academic thinking, there is a gate, there is a system where a lot of people are not permitted to come in, right? So we have admissions, for example, we have different criteria that admit people within that particular system. And we have the physical infrastructure, we have the cognitive infrastructure, we have the intellectual infrastructure, and all those things put together is what define that elite institution. And so there is a huge academic thinking that is restricted. And a lot of people, as a matter of fact, I think UNESCO and other sources mention that of the population of people who are at the universities, for example, less than 1.5% are within what we refer as, elite institutions. And then somebody in the elite institution also has the advantage of what is called cultural capital, right? So cultural capital basically is a term that was coined by the French sociologist Perret, who basically sees cultural capital as a means where when people who are within a particular system, enrich themselves because they are connected. It's more like synonymous to what you refer to as network. So for example, you go to Harvard, just by going to Harvard or going to Stanford gives you some cultural capital because of the network, that you establish within that particular system. And people from the global South do not have that similar intellectual cultural capital. And then, of course, you notice that there's a marginalization of under-resourced universities from the global south. And so this is where prompting now comes in. And that's my argument, that prompting could actually break this particular gate we have here, where people from those under-resourced communities will be able to develop a cognitive ability, through prompting that allow them to begin to actually engage in a high-level way of thinking that is typical of people within these gated communities. And so briefly, when we talk about prompting, there are two major types of prompting. There is a technical component of prompting, which, for example, if I'm writing on Python, for instance, and I'm trying to work on a particular script, I could actually have a prompt initiated within my Python program. But the main one I'm talking about is the non-technical one, which is the everyday use of prompts, where people just go to ChatGPT, they don't understand the internal structure of ChatGPT, and they're giving instruction to ChatGPT and get all kinds of responses. So programmers are using the technical kind of prompting, the non-programmers are using the non-technical kind of prompting, where we have a few short prompts, zero prompt, chain of thought prompt, and all kinds of prompting within those spaces. So I'm focusing more on the non-technical part of prompting because the core idea is to democratize and argue that other people from low resource institutions could actually develop these cognitive skills. So my major question is, can AI help students think like scholars, not just write like them? Now, currently we know that AI has helped students, for example, to start writing like professors. For instance, I could maybe pick 3 or 4 papers from Sydney, for instance, and then just feed it to ChatGPT and then tell ChatGPT, hey, write exactly using that same language, the same syntax, the same sentence structure, pattern, everything on a particular topic. And it's going to mimic Sydney's kind of pattern, right? But does that mean that the students are thinking like Sydney? The answer is no. And so my argument is, can these systems now help students not just to write like a particular scholar, but to start thinking like that particular scholar? So this is why I introduced the prompt-based cognitive equivalence theory, PB-set. And so PB-set is a learning theory that posits that students, regardless of institutional affiliation, can attain epistemic parity with elite academic thinkers through recursively structured prompt interactions with generative AI systems. And so when these prompts are designed very carefully, 5 things are basically going to happen. They will initiate inquiry, they will emulate expert thinking, they will simulate intellectual dialogue and internalize advanced epistemic habits, as well as independently generate original insight. And again, this is a scaffolding, so they grow from, asking some basic questions, and again, they have to be trained and taught on exactly how to actually think and engage with this system in a very much critical way that will allow them to produce the kind of cognitive level of thinking that I'm arguing about. And so this is the 5 major layers of how this works. So it starts from emulation, right, where they prompt the system to possibly maybe think like a particular scholar. I'm going to give us an example I have initially where I simulated, a panel session with Foucault as the moderator, and other people like Butler, other people as being members of that particular panel and having a conversation on a particular topic. And so after emulation, they go to simulation, then internalization, ideation, of course, then the output. Now, this is the PB set path. And I will explain what this diagram actually is just doing very briefly. Now, if you look at the top of the diagram, right? So you'll see the entry point, which is the non-elite institutions. And here you see the diverse students as well. And so this represents the majority of the global learner population. So students from underfunded institution, resource environment, and the rest of them make up these 2 major group here. Now, if you look at the left, we'll see the elite universities who are feeding into what I call elite university pathway, elite university path. And of course, this is the traditional route to common cognitive capital currently in the world, and is characterized by, as I mentioned initially, selective admission, institutional mentorship, access to networks, exposures to canonical traditions, and so many other things. And so it's very highly gated, with only a small percentage of people actually being able to take this particular route. Now, but now we are introducing an alternative middle layer, which everyone knows generally as, prompt engineering, which actually allows students from non-elite institutions, who are taught how to prompt using this particular theory we are proposing here, to start simulating the cognitive labor that is typical, of these elite universities. And then if you look at the middle here now, right? So I use ChatGPT here. It could actually be DeepSeek, Perplexity, Gemini, Grok, Gwen, or whichever one. I use Gwen in the case study I'm going to show us eventually later. It could be anyone here. So then this interface is, of course, is now where, the students are not able to mimic and do everything they want to do. But the most important thing here is that prompting is already a very popular thing. But what the focus here is that there is a dialogical form of prompting that is scaffolding, whereas as someone is prompting, for example, we're able to have a track and a trace of how his prompting is developing and increasing. And so as the prompting is increasing, we'll be able to track to what extent is this person's cognitive ability becoming better, and not just mimicking the writing style of a particular scholar, but now beginning to think even more critically like those scholars, are actually now thinking. And so that scaffolding is documented in what we call the prompt templates. And so that's where when we look at the prompt template, for example, we'll see the prompt the person used yesterday, last week, last month, and see how there's increment in those growth and the difficulty and the kind of questions that the person is beginning to ask, those prompts. And so when this ChatGPT interface and prompt templates begin to merge, then we arrive at what we call the cognitive equivalence, where that particular diverse students or people from non-institutional elite institution begin to develop or simulate the thinking that is basically known to be done by people in the elite universities. And now we know basically that there are three major ways, we use AI. We have the augmentation, we have the automation, we have the co-creation. Somebody, I think it was Vin, I can't remember his name very well again, who talked about automation using N8N. So we have augmentation, we have co-creation. And at each of this level, people have to be taught, especially people from this under-resourced institution have to be taught exactly what happens at each of this level. For example, when we're talking about automation, of course, agentic AI is just a lot of automation, right? But when we're talking about this PB set theory, we're talking about both augmentation and co-creation, and not necessarily automation. Of course, automation could be an aftermath eventually, but the focus actually is on co-creation, how those students are taught to co-create with the system. And so this is the case study I was talking about. So here I kind of simulated a scene where I wanted Foucault to be, the panel lead in this particular conversation on the topic AI-generated content, and then I have people like Kant, Du Bois, Ngugi, Wationgo, and Butler. And of course, I didn't share the prompt here, but the prompt I shared was that, hey, Foucault should act as the person leading this particular panel, but every other person here should contribute to this particular panel. Some should disagree, some should agree. There's other ones I simulated that are quite very long, but the point here is if you carefully read, each of these responses by this, each of these characters or by each of these scholars, you will notice that every of their response, this is not necessarily their full language, but the idea, the summation of the argument reflects the way they argue generally as a scholar. And so what happens is a student simulate this kind of response, for instance, this is a continuation, and then the student is now able to begin to think around. For example, the student is talking about AI-generated content, and students understand what Kant is talking about, or how Kant possibly could think about AI-generated content, or how Du Bois or Ngugi or Butler could think about AI-generated content. And the interesting thing here is the students will begin to notice that each of these people are talking from different ways. And so it helps them to even begin to build interdisciplinary and multidisciplinary way of thinking around the same particular issue, which again is how knowledge, is increased, or how knowledge grows, and how we begin to synthesize, idea in a very strong, critical way. And so here, again, I just have this table to show the difference between traditional versus modern and versus the PB set approach. For example, we have the typical behaviorist learning model, which is stimulus response, kind of reaction, right? But in the CPET model or the PB CPET model, we treat learning as a recursive cognitive model. So it's the reasoning loop. That's why I said there is a record of collecting the prompts that the person has been using over time. And in some cases, depending on the learners, we actually have a prompt diary where we could share with the learner, and the learner can begin to contextualize those prompt diaries to suit it to our own content, depending again on what the learner is interested on and what the learner intends to ask. Again, even just sharing the prompt diary to the learner, which again is presented in a scaffolding way, is to allow them to see what is possible to be achieved, with the system. And because again, if you give the prompt basically to someone and say, do you know that you could begin to think, let me say, like somebody in Stanford or Oxford or any elite university, for instance, the person could be confused. But with those bank of prompts, then it becomes easier for them to actually see how that growth can actually scaffold from the basic, from where they are, and just take it up gradually. Again, I understand that learning is made up of quite a lot of things. It's not just the abstract reasoning. There's also the role that the physical infrastructure also plays. Now I know that the theory we are proposing does not deal with the physical infrastructure, but again, even dealing with those ones that operate outside the physical infrastructure plays a huge role in trying to transform how the learners outside those environments actually think and begin to actually implement a lot of things. Now, studies have already shown actually that prompting has helped people to generate all kinds of business ideas and startups, and it create their ideas and the rest of them. And so in this similar way, this can also help those students from under-resourced communities and under-resourced universities to actually also simulate, in a sense, the thinking patterns, and how the reasoning and how the level and quality of work produced by scholars in well-resourced institutions are situated. And then here, as I begin to round off, rethinking AI's role in learning, the University of San Diego has about 39 application of AI in academia or in education. And I summarize them just using these few little bullet points here. And if you look at the right-hand side, depending on how you're looking, where I have the prompt-based cognitive equivalent theory, and then I have, the mainstream AI in education and how they're actually a little bit different from each other and what the focus of each other is. For example, generally, everybody knows that, hey, that AI has helped people to personalize content delivery, right? But to what extent does it actually help to reconstruct cognition through recursive prompt logic, which is basically what I'm arguing, right? That it's not just personalizing content delivery, but now helping to reconstruct actually cognition itself. There is a huge emphasis on, AI reducing critical thinking. But if we actually reimagine, how people could be thought on how, when they're engaging with this prompting, it could not begin to actually improve again their cognitive abilities. But again, this has to be taught in a very structured way, which is what we're actually proposing, so that people don't just go to the system and just ask very shallow, zero prompt or few prompt kind of question. Ideally, to be able to actually get the kind of response we're talking about from the dialogical way of prompting we are discussing, it has to be a very detailed prompt. Sometimes you have something like a context and you detail the context. You have something like a task, you detail the something like a constraint and permissions and many other things, that allow the system. Again, if someone is able to provide those level of instruction to the system, it's also a reflection of some higher level of intelligence or application of that particular system as well. And so I remember this movie as a roundoff, that is called Limitless, where we have this mysterious pill that somebody took, and it enables him to access 100% of his brain's ability, which of course dramatically improves his cognition and capabilities. So I see prompt engineering, as being able to actually simulate that kind of result. Of course, not 100% of the brain's ability. I don't think anyone actually uses 100% of their brain's ability, by the way, right? But just to show that it is possible, actually, that using this particular approach, you could actually help people to actually, come to a better place in terms of the quality of work that they actually produce, and not just mimic, what people write, but also now begin to actually become original in their own thinking because of how much they have engaged with this system. And so if the human mind can be shaped by recursive dialogue and AI can simulate such dialogue, then elite cognition is no longer institution bound. We can use the CPET's approach to bring such academic and intellectual cognitive gap. Thank you very much.